No, not today. Some of the ones coming up will have some prezzies that go along with them. All right, so our topic for today is the civil rights movement in the 1950s. Okay. The first couple points, most of the points are sort of driven by some key questions that I want to go over with you guys. All right, the first question is, first off, we're talking about the civil rights movement. What are civil rights? All right. So a couple just sort of basic bullet points to understand. When we talk about civil rights, one, we're talking about the basic rights that a person has simply by being a citizen. The basic rights that a person has simply by being a citizen of the United States. And so, what are some examples we can think of in terms of civil rights? What are some of your basic rights that you have?
Right to assemble.
Okay, good. The right to assemble, or the right of assembly. What are some other ones?
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech, absolutely. We would consider freedom of speech to be one of your inherent civil rights.
Right to bear arms.
Yeah, I wouldn't really say that's one of the major ones. I mean, certainly it's a hot topic one, but here we're talking about like basic rights that can't be really reasonably taken away.
Freedom of petition.
Okay, petition, yep.
Religion.
Freedom of religion. So we're talking about these First Amendment freedoms. The right to bear arms, I mean, I wouldn't really say that we would consider that a civil right. It's definitely a right. Okay. But here we're talking about the core essential rights that you have as a citizen. And one that would often be put in here is voting. And that's kind of a tricky question, because if you ask people, is voting a right or is voting a privilege, you're going to get different answers. I think a lot of people would say voting is a basic right you have as a citizen. Okay? So for our purposes, I'm going to put this in here and say it is a civil right that you have. There's some argument there, right? Some people say, no, voting's actually a privilege. Voting can legitimately be taken away.
Like you go to jail.
Sure, like some states, Virginia included, disenfranchises felons, right? If you are a felon, you lose your right to vote in Virginia. You can get it back, but this long drawn out process.
Why?
It's a punishment, essentially, right? We restrict voting to minors, right? So voting, it's a little questionable, right? Is it a civil right, or is it actually a privilege that citizens have? And for our purposes, we're going to put it in here with civil rights, because voting is an important component of the civil rights movement, the fight for equal voting rights. So ultimately what we're getting at here is all of these come down to one overarching theme, and that is equal treatment under the law. Civil rights, in a lot of ways, just boil down to equal treatment under the law. We saw that in the film we watched, right? That's the big argument, is that segregated schools deny equal treatment. So with regards to the civil rights movement, we're going to see civil rights leaders fight for things like equal opportunities. We're going to see civil rights leaders fight for things like equal access to public facilities and public goods. So our second question asks, what were the main barriers to civil rights for African Americans in the 1950s? So we've established what we mean when we're discussing civil rights, okay? So what were the barriers? What were the things that were blocking African Americans from enjoying this equal treatment.
Separate but equal.
Okay. Certainly, the idea of separate but equal was a barrier. All right. What was the name of the case that established that?
Plessy versus Ferguson.
Plessy versus Ferguson. I just capped this. It doesn't work if the cap is on. Plessy versus Ferguson was a major barrier. Plessy versus Ferguson was decided in 1896.
Not like in parentheses, you just write separate but equal.
I would certainly put in there that that is the case that established the idea of separate but equal. The Supreme Court of the United States ruled that separate but equal was okay. Right? Segregation is legal so long as the separate facilities are separate but equal. What are some other potential barriers we could think of?
Discrimination.
Okay, absolutely. Prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice and discrimination were widespread. That's a barrier. It's a legacy of the institution of human slavery. It is a legacy that still exists today, right? It is one of the major issues facing our country, right? And it stems from the fact that African Americans were enslaved in this country for hundreds of years. Another major barrier that African Americans had to overcome, especially in the South, but not just in the South, was a lack of political power. A lack of political power.
Yeah, you kind of explained what you mean by that. I mean, I know that they couldn't have these. It was basically what you're saying. They didn't have any like people in the government. They didn't have anybody that would listen to them.
Right? Their ability to vote was often very restricted. Right? African Americans had a hard time running for political office. Right? And if we remember anything from last semester, right? Who do politicians focus on?
Like the white rich people.
Who do politicians focus on today?
The 1%ers.
Oh, middle class.
Still haven't heard it. People who vote. Politicians focus their attention on people who vote, right? Because that's who they need to convince in order to keep their job. Politicians aren't going to focus on people who don't vote because they don't help them get reelected, right? So a lack of political power, when African Americans are prohibited from equal voting rights, politicians aren't going to really focus on what African Americans want, right? There were the number of African Americans who were able to run and win political office, very limited, right? Not non-existent, but very limited. A fourth barrier that African Americans faced and had to try to overcome was a lack of educational and economic opportunities. A lack of educational and economic opportunities.
Educational.
Educational and economic. And that's sort of tied together, right? We talked about that yesterday. That when you do not get equal educational opportunities, you're not likely to go to college, not likely to get the better, higher paying white collar jobs. And then that results in being in economic dependency, right? And not doing well economically. Which helps account for the fact that African Americans were largely left out of the prosperity of the 1950s, right? We're catching how things tie together here. So our third question asks, what were the main goals of the civil rights movement? Well, we could probably pick two of the major goals, right? Based off of what we've learned and what we've just talked about. Right? We talked about barriers. So what do you think are going to be the major goals?
Ending discrimination or segregation to kind of get people to realize that everyone's equal.
Segregation in schools.
Okay.
That
But how are you going to do? What do you have to do in order to get rid of segregation in schools? What's the big barrier you got to get rid of?
the courts.
You're going to get rid of the court?
I mean, like, get rid of the.
Was to gain equal treatment under the law.
Okay. So that's a goal, right? That is certainly one of the major goals, to gain equal treatment and equal opportunities. To gain equal treatment and equal opportunities. That's a major goal.
Wait, equal treatment, what? Okay.
In order to ensure equal treatment, what do you have to knock down? Which of the barriers must be knocked down? Okay, which means we have to do what? We want to end segregation. What do we have to get rid of?
The law.
The separate but equal.
Which came from
Supreme Court.
Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay, that is one of the absolute primary goals: is get rid of Plessy versus Ferguson. Right? Fight to get Plessy versus Ferguson overturned.
To do that, was Brown versus the Board of Education the case that knocked down Plessy versus Ferguson, or
It's a first strike at it. It does not. It specifically eliminated segregation in public schools. It didn't touch segregation in marriage.
Yeah.
It didn't touch segregation in housing or any of those other areas we discussed, but it's a major first strike,
okay?
right? And then as time goes, that the same group of guys, right, led by Earl Warren, is going to take the lead in striking down segregation in those other areas until Plessy versus Ferguson is completely wiped
It's
out.
wiped out still.
Yeah, I mean it's
gone.
yeah, it is done,
Okay.
right? But I don't want you to think Brown versus Board of Education overturned it completely, right? Segregation still exists, and as we're going to learn in a few minutes, segregation in schooling still exists, right? Still existed after the Brown decision. All right, so main methods. What were some of the main methods that were used? Well, we know of one from the film we just watched.
Session.
Having laws or decisions overturned legally in
Okay,
courts.
lawsuits.
Boycotts?
Yep, we'll get to that one in just a second. Lawsuits is a major one, right? Groups like the NAACP are going to challenge segregation laws in the court. They're going to challenge segregation laws in the court. All right, Lana just hit on a second major strategy or major method used to protest segregation, and that's economic protests. Economic protests. And the biggest one used was specifically boycotts. Right, so what does a boycott mean?
You don't buy. Resisting is
Right.
certain
We're not
ways.
going to buy something. We're not going to do something. Right. We're going to let's say. So, for instance, there's a segregated business. We won't shop there. If there's a segregated service, we refuse to use it. Okay. And we'll talk about probably the most well-known example of that in a few minutes. What's Martin Luther King Jr. known for?
Peaceful, non-violent marches.
Non-violent protests, right? This becomes a hallmark of the civil rights movement. And it doesn't mean that there's never any violence. There's certainly violence against,
Civil disobedience.
right, yeah, civil disobedience or non-violent protests. certainly there's violence committed against those in the civil rights movement. And there's occasionally fighting back from those in the civil rights movement. But people like Martin Luther King were preaching, no, don't fight back, right? If you get hit, you just got to take it and not fight back, right? Because it's going to make the other group look that much worse, that they're hitting someone and hurting someone that's not fighting back. So nonviolent protests become a hallmark of the civil rights movement. Marches, boycotts are nonviolent, right?
The Black Panthers, they were violent though.
They were violent, but I don't really associate them particularly with the civil rights movement.
Okay.
They're more of a Black Power movement of the 70s. So they have some of the same goals in terms of trying to achieve things for African Americans, but they're so different in their approach that I personally don't really associate them with the civil rights movement.
Now,
They'll get enforced,
who
though.
was Malcolm? Was Malcolm X more associated with nonviolence, or was he? More this
He's sort of an
fat
interesting
black-
character. He's associated with a little bit more violent
Okay.
approach, but then he has sort of a change of heart, and he advocates later on for a little bit more nonviolent approach. So he's sort of an interesting character.
And then
He'd be an interesting research topic, actually.
then he gets assassinated.
He was assassinated.
Watch the Butler.
I have seen the Butler. All right, so question 5 asks, so who are some of the main leaders? All right, and just a couple quick bullet points here. We know from our film, right, that some of the leaders came from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, right, and that's that group we saw in the film, led by Thurgood Marshall. Another very prominent person was Oliver Hill, who was one of the characters in the film we watched. So some of these lawyers were really on the front lines of challenging segregation laws. Certainly there's lots of individuals that we could put down, but we're talking about like the main people who are in front for like a long period of time. Those lawyers like Thurgood Marshall are major players. And who else have we talked about?
Rosa Parks.
Okay, yeah, but she's not really like she's certainly a civil rights leader. There's no doubt about that, right? But she's not. I don't really associate her at the same level that I do with Thurgood Marshall as like somebody who's like constantly out in front and leading the fight. She's certainly an important character. She's certainly an important civil rights leader. There's no doubt about that. Martin Luther King Jr., right? And what was his job?
Preacher.
He's a preacher, right? Remember the question we talked about the other day, right? A lot of civil rights leadership came from ministers, right? For example, most notably, Martin Luther King Jr.
What was Malcolm X? What did he start off doing?
I don't recall offhand what his profession was.
He just rose as a leader.
He rose up through a group called the Muslim Brotherhood, and then he actually split with them, and that's what ended up leading to his assassination. So lawyers like Thurgood Marshall, ministers especially like Martin Luther King Jr., and absolutely they're not the only ones, right? They're the ones that are like really out there in front, pushing the charge for civil rights. But there are lots of other individuals, absolutely like Rosa Parks, who play major roles in the civil rights movement. We're going to watch when we come back, we'll watch a video about children, right? Children in the Deep South who played an important role in resisting segregation. Now, if you put Rosa Parks down, absolutely, you can put her down, right? But the ones I really want to talk about is like being out in front, like and really leading the charge. Lawyers, ministers, okay? All right, so what were some of the main steps taken? Okay, we talked a lot about lawsuits. So, one, there were lawsuits filed to require equal pay between blacks and whites. Two, there were lawsuits to require whites-only graduate schools to admit African Americans if there was no other equivalent program. I'll say that one again. There were lawsuits to require whites-only graduate schools to admit African Americans if there were no other equivalent programs, right? So an example would be there was a lawsuit in Maryland filed by Thurgood Marshall, right, that said he wanted to be admitted to the University of Maryland Law School because the state of Maryland did not offer a blacks-only law school. There were lawsuits to require whites-only colleges to admit black students if there were not equal black colleges.
What?
There were lawsuits to force whites-only colleges to admit black students if there were not equivalent black colleges, right? If there weren't equal black colleges. And these are all lawsuits that NAACP lawyers win. And we saw that in the film we watched, right? Where people said, hang on, we've won these lawsuits where we've asked for equal, and then when there wasn't equal, they were forced to admit black students, right? So we saw that in the film. And of course, boycotts, right? Boycotts were very effective in forcing businesses to give customers equal treatment. So we're talking about things like stores and restaurants, right? African Americans and others would boycott to get equal treatment.
Wait, this is a little bit off topic, not really. For the bus boycott, was it got ruined because not a lot of whites went on the bus because they had the cars themselves?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in the next bullet point here.
Okay.
So let me come back to that.
Alright.
Okay. So let's talk about major events. Okay, and these certainly it's not meant to be a comprehensive list of major events, but it gives you an idea of some of the major events.
Wait, did we already go over 6?
Yes, we just talked about 6.
Okay.
So major events. One we should be very familiar with, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. And that's the film we just watched.
Was it called Brown because their skin was brown?
No, it's called Brown because the person's last name was Brown.
Just wondering.
There were 5 different cases, right, that all got lumped together, and the first one listed was Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. So all 5 of those cases are just commonly known as Brown versus Board of Education. And the Brown case declared that segregated schools were unconstitutional. We should be very familiar with that one because we just spent a week watching the film.
That was a pretty good movie.
It was a good movie. It's made for TV too. But just about anything with Sidney Poitier in it's going to be pretty good. He's a great actor. 1955 was the year of the Montgomery bus boycott. And then the Montgomery bus boycott gets kicked off because of a little old lady named Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat to a white man and was put in jail for it. Martin Luther King and some others come in and organize a citywide bus boycott in protest. The boycott is extremely effective, right? Primarily because, as you said, it's who is mostly taking public transportation? African Americans, right? The affluent whites who are living out in the suburbs, they're driving their cars, right? So all of a sudden, these buses that require this large group of African Americans to keep riding in order to make money, 90% or so of the city doesn't ride the bus anymore, right? African Americans refuse to ride the bus, and it eventually led to the elimination of segregated buses in Montgomery.
Since when were the bus drivers allowed to carry guns? Yeah, I kind of found weird about that movie because the guy was carrying guns.
It's the Deep South, man. It's a whole new world. It is a whole new world. All right, the third event I want to talk about is 1957. The Little Rock Nine. Which sounds like a rock band, or perhaps a baseball team, but it is not. The Little Rock Nine refers to when 9 black students were admitted into an all-white high school in Arkansas. And it became a national news story because Arkansas tried to refuse to admit them. Right? Even the governor of Arkansas came out and said, no, we're not going to admit these 9 students. And it became a huge story because the President of the United States said, yes, you are. Right? And so if we can finish up here, I'm going to show a quick video clip of it. All right, so lastly, let's talk about some results throughout the 1950s. Okay. Number 1, there were some legal victories that started to break down barriers, right? Like Board of Education. Some of those legal victories started to break down barriers. Number 2, another result was the emergence of strong leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., like Thurgood Marshall, right? That the civil rights movement gets some really, really strong leadership in the 1950s. Number 3, and the flip side of number 2, is that there also emerged a very strong opposition to the civil rights movement.
A very strong what?
Opposition. And not just, I mean, the obvious thing that pops into your mind is, the KKK, violence, right? But not just, there's political resistance, right? There's resistance in nonviolent ways as well.
Did some people just think it was too soon?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Like the lawyer who was arguing Brown versus the Board of Education.
Sure. A fourth result, and this ties specifically to the Brown versus Board of Education case, was something called massive resistance.
Is this when, like, I guess this is the term, white flight.
No, white flight has to do with white people moving out of cities towards the suburbs, right? As African Americans are moving in. That's talking about more of a geographical, right? Massive resistance refers to states in the South, particularly, Virginia was one of the worst offenders, flatly refusing to obey the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So when we talk about massive resistance, we're talking about states who refuse to integrate their public schools.
Didn't a lot of private schools open up during this period? Or was
I don't know how many opened. One of the thoughts was, white people will send their kids to private schools, right, rather than let them go to an integrated school. And there was some of that. I don't know what the research would say in terms of how widespread that was. But Virginia, as I said, one of the worst offenders. Virginia actually shut down some of its public schools rather than integrate. And lastly, throughout the 1950s, there is an increase in tension and frustration between both sides. An increase in tension and frustration on both sides. And so, as we move into the 1960s, right, which we'll get into a little bit, more when we get back, that tension is going to sometimes spill over violently, and will eventually lead to the President of the United States going on national television and making a declaration that segregation needs to come to a close.